For this 14th lecture in our second series, we're back in the late Ming, that exciting time of controversy and change and masters of striking originality. Some of them, such as Wu Bin and Zhang Hong, have been undervalued in traditional Chinese writings, and others, like the subject of this lecture, Chen Hongshou, have had a lot written about them, but not much that seems to me really to the point, at least as it's seen by one modern and foreign art historian, that is myself. Lots of biographical stuff, lots of work done from texts, not much that's based on looking at his paintings, virtually nothing that tries to interpret their expressive subtleties. This lecture is about a few of Chen Hongshou's many surviving paintings, and it will also be about people I've known who have been somehow involved with him and his paintings, such as collectors or dealers or as museum people or in some other capacity. I myself have been deeply engaged with Chen Hongshou from early in my career. Our first seminar exhibition at UC Berkeley, that is the Restless Landscape of 1971 to 72, included 5 of his paintings, the exhibition did. And other exhibitions and publications that I've worked on include quite a few more, maybe 30 or so in all. He was a prolific artist. There's a lot about him in Chinese literature, as I say, and his paintings raise lots of interesting problems, not only stylistic. First images, please. I begin with a poor image pulled from the website of our Berkeley Art Museum, where the painting is now, of this very familiar work. Many of you will know it. Why is it so familiar? It's a genuine and fine work, but it's hardly one of the most striking or the most significant among Chen Hongshou's works. It was owned by Victoria Kontag, part of the collection she put together during her years in Shanghai in the 1940s. Her collection was stored at the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City, looked after by her old friend Lawrence Sickman. And Sickman, when he came to write his part of the textbook titled The Art and Architecture of China, reproduced it and wrote about it there. And since that's the textbook that we used for many years in teaching Chinese art history, and slides for all the works in it were easily available, and so they were in many university slide libraries, we all thought of it as Chen Hongshou's typical work. When the Kontag sale to Brundage failed and her paintings were dispersed, we acquired this one for our Berkeley, or then called University Art Museum, now Berkeley Art Museum. I won't talk about the painting now because I don't have good slides, maybe in a future lecture, because this certainly won't be the last one to treat Chen Hongshou and his paintings. Next. 3 paintings by him were in my Fantastics and Eccentrics exhibition of 1967. He was written about in the Restless Landscape catalog, mostly by Stella Lee, seen here in her essay on late Ming figure painting, although we did include one landscape. She wrote, as in all her writing, with lots of original perceptions and supplied information that the scholar with girl servants, for instance, bears a signature that he began using only in 1646, but it must be a late work. She is very smart and was and still is a terrific writer. Next. I put on this group photo, taken at one of my birthday celebrations with a group of my former students, only to call attention to the person at the far left, standing somewhat apart and wearing glasses. This is Wei Kun Tang, and I seem to have no other photo of him easily accessible. And I use him to introduce another seminar and another book, the one titled The Painter's Practice, How Artists Lived and Worked in Traditional China. The seminar was held in the early 1990s, and the book was published in 1994. Wei Kun Tang was a principal participant in that, and he worked hard afterwards to help me in organizing all the diverse materials that had been collected by him and the others, so that I could make the lectures and a book out of them. He has also recently worked long and hard revising and correcting the Chinese translation of that book, which is just now, January 2012, appeared in Chinese. So tell your Chinese friends to buy copies. Next. Quite a few Chen Hongshou paintings are cited in this book, and incidents from his life because he is, among other artists, especially well recorded. On page 109 of that book, I reproduced these 3 works by Chen and used them to make points about how Chinese studio artists used family members and assistants, who are named in Chen's inscriptions on these, to help with the coloring, filling in fabric patterns, and other workshop jobs, and also how a painter of this kind might make multiple copies of a composition for sale to people who needed them for celebrations or for presentations, or presentations of birthdays or weddings, for instance. The immortal presenting gifts, which is the subject of these paintings, would be appropriate for either one. And this tells us one basic thing about Chen Hongshou, that he was such an artist who used followers or helpers, who fulfilled commissions, who turned out functional paintings in numbers for sale to his customers. In short, he was a thoroughgoing professional artist. And if you believe that a painter of this sort couldn't really produce great paintings, think again. Or as I've said before, go join that other lecture room down the hall. Next, please. Once more, I show a group photograph to call attention to the person at far left. This time, along with myself and Howard and Marianne Rogers, sitting and drinking tea on the veranda of some Japanese villa, it's Anne Burkus, now Anne Burkus Chasson, who took her doctorate with me and teaches now at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. She took on Chen Hongshou for her doctoral dissertation topic, and she wrote a terrific multi-volume work on him, with masses of translation and other information, as well as all the fruits of her very acute mind. But, alas, she has never reworked it for publication, as I've been urging her to do for decades. Next, please. I put Anne on screen to introduce another story about a Chen Hongshou painting. I was on the East Coast with a group of my students, and I arranged for some of them to come with me to C.C. Wang's apartment, where we asked him to show us all the Chen Hongshou paintings that he had. And this one came out, among others. It's hanging against the background of his closet in this image. And Anne went for it immediately and convinced me, which wasn't hard, about how good and important it was. And I ended up trading something that Wang wanted for it and getting it as my own. I think it's still in the Berkeley Art Museum. It represents the meeting between 2 generals of the Han Dynasty, Su Wu and Li Ling. Okay, now I'm going to read from my Distant Mountains book about these paintings. Here we go. Painting that can be roughly dated to the same period, that is the late 1630s, by its style and its inscription, is Chen Hongshou's Meeting of Su Wu and Li Ling. Li Ling was a Han Dynasty 2nd century BC general who, when he was captured by the Huns, transferred his allegiance to the Hunnish Khan, whose daughter he married. His old friend Su Wu was sent out on a peace mission to the Huns. When his companions went over to the Khan's service, he refused to join them, and as punishment, he was sent to the bleak northern regions to herd sheep. Li Ling was dispatched to make a last attempt to persuade him to renounce his Chinese loyalism, but he failed. The theme especially is depicted in the poignant last meeting of the 2 friends, became an established image of loyalist integrity. A depiction of it by Li Gonglin was inscribed by the late Song loyalist martyr Wan Tianxiang and Zhao Mengfu, whose own career was painfully involved with the loyalist issue, may have alluded to it in one of his paintings and so forth. That's all for that thing. But then on the next page, I write this about the painting itself. The 4 figures in the painting stand in an arc close to the picture plane, like actors on a stage. At the left is Su Wu, holding a shepherd's staff with multicolored tassels. Li Ling stands in profile in the foreground. Behind him, an attendant wearing military garb with a purse and dagger slung from his waistband holds a standard with a design of a dragon in the clouds, emblem of the Chinese emperor, and here, by reverse implication, of Li Ling's disloyalty. Another attendant completes the group, clasping a cylindrical object with both arms. Li Ling wears a soldier's hat and belt with sword and jacket with lotus insignia. Su Wu's costume is of coarse material and is tied with a simple cloth sash. Several large holes reveal his undergarments, and his toe is exposed by a hole in his one boot. Chen Hongshou's typical drapery drawing of this period derived ultimately from archaic conventions, including the zhanbi, or tremulous brushstroke manner, which Sui Zhezhong was using for another effect around this time. Here renders the rumpling and creasing of thick cloth and suggests the hard outdoor life of the participants. Both Su Wu and Li Ling hold their hands raised to their faces. The gestures are ambivalent. On the simpler level, we are to understand that they are blowing on their hands for warmth. But with our knowledge of the situation, we cannot avoid reading Li Ling's gesture as one of hiding his face in shame, and Su Wu's as part of his whole physical expression of painfully mixed feelings, as he is pulled by his old friendship while recoiling in distaste from Li's proposal. The attendant at right, sensitive to the indignity of his master's position, turns his face away and rolls his eyes upward. The tableau is emotionally affecting, at the same time that the oddness of the drawing and the theatricality of the poses stress its artificiality. The expressiveness is too intense to ring quite true. That's the end of the passage I'm quoting from the book. Next, please. This is another handscroll painted by Chen Hongshou with the help of two other artists, a portrait of a man named He Tianzhang sitting in his garden together with his wife or concubine and a small servant playing a flute. I published it twice and also used it in my Getty lectures for different purposes in the Painter's Practice book. I used it to write about the use of studio assistants. Chen Hongshou himself painted only the figures in it, leaving it for his disciple Yan Zhan to do the setting, and a third painter, presumably a portrait specialist, was brought in to paint the face of the main figure. In my compelling image book, in the chapter titled Portraits of Real People and Others, I used it to discuss that distinction, which isn't so simple, between real portraits of real people and pictures of imagined people, as He Tianzhang and his concubine were. In my Getty lectures on Ming-Qing paintings of women, I used it to show how the woman in a painting of this kind, even if she represents a real individual, is often reduced to a type, not shown as an individual. Moreover, she makes a positive commentary on the man's continuing virility by holding up a fan with a blossoming plum branch on it, the ability of old plum trees to continue blossoming into old age was a common symbol for that. I cite these three readings now only to make my often made point about how good Chinese paintings, like good Western paintings, are polysemous, have many meanings, that is. That's a word I haven't used for decades, and I'm not partial to such heavy Latin terms, but it seems appropriate here. Next, please. Chen Hongshou did, however, do at least one portrait of a real woman, and presumably others as well. This one, which he painted in 1637 of a woman I haven't identified, I know only from a reproduction. I think it's in the Zhejiang Provincial Museum. The section of my Getty lectures was devoted to real and imaginary portraits of women. I must put those lectures with their illustrations on my website, since it's highly unlikely now that they will ever be published in book form, as was my original intention. Next. We turn next to a major Chen Hongshou painting and a major controversy surrounding it. This is the work that he painted, at least I think he painted, in 1635, titled A Tall Pine and Taoist Immortal, representing the artist himself and his nephew in a landscape setting. I reproduced it in color and discussed it at length in both my Distant Mountains and my compelling image books. It has been for me one of the most fascinating and expressively complex of Chinese paintings. To judge it fairly and interpret it at some length has been a challenge for me. Next. But its authenticity has not gone unchallenged. Wang Guowang, seen here is a notable doubter. As I recounted in one of my addenda to our first series, the one about the 1999 Authenticity Symposium at the Metropolitan Museum, Wang Go was one of the two people brought in by Wen Feng to add to the overwhelmingly anti-Cahill forces who dominated that symposium, or at least were intended to. Next. His paper argued that the painting is impossible as a genuine Chen Hongshou and must be a forgery. I won't try to summarize his argument, which uses both visual observations and textual problems, to try to prove his case. Those of you seriously interested can read it in the symposium volume and judge for yourselves, especially after I show and talk about the painting. Wang Go, old friend, sometimes adversary, is the descendant by several generations of the distinguished Qing dynasty statesman Wang Tonghe, 1830 to 1904, and he inherited his collection of Chinese paintings. He's also a maker of educational films. Several works by Chen Hongshou were in his inherited collection, and he took on the role of a specialist scholar of the artist, compiling a 3-volume collection of plates of his works with text. He, of course, is partial to paintings that were in his own collection, as anyone would be, and suspicious of many others. I think he was quite wrong about the 1635 self-portrait, and I will now show it and talk about it as a genuine and fascinatingly complex work by this great artist. Chen Hongshou's inscription, written in the upper right, reads, "Master Lotus and nephew Han have been roaming at ease for days on end. In spring we have been intoxicated by the beauty of peach blossoms. In autumn we have contemplated the charm of the hibiscus. In summer we have stumbled through thick growths of pine. In late winter we have made verses about the whiteness of snow. In all things we looked after each other, leafing through numerous books, feeling doubly relaxed in spirit, practicing pure talk and sketching pines and rocks. If these words accord somewhat with the Tao, why should we feel ashamed to eat the 3 meals?" And I go on to explain. The cryptic last line alludes to a passage in the Taoist book of Zhuangzi, which points out that a man traveling only to the suburbs with enough food for 3 meals comes back with his stomach full, while one setting out on a 1,000-mile journey must carry enough provisions for 3 months. If one's excursions are modest, that is, one's needs will be also modest. Chen adds the date, the spring of 1635, and his signature. I've written so much about this painting, and my argument about it is so complex, and I'm not going to try to repeat it here. You can read it in my books at the library if you don't own them. It will be enough for the present purpose to make relatively brief comments as I show the slides. Okay, next. Chen's nephew takes on the role of the boy servant, who nearly always accompanies the noble scholar in old paintings of this kind of subject. But his face is more individualized, maybe caricaturing the real nephew's face, and he has flowers stuck into his hat, and also into the top of the covered basket that he carries, perhaps containing their provisions for their travels. He seems to hold another object, maybe a bottle of wine, in the other arm, hidden behind him. Beyond that, I'll say only that the combination of high aesthetic refinement and mock heavy-handedness in the drawing is not the work of a forger. I would pretty much stake my reputation on that. Next. The same is true of the landscape setting. Chen Hongshou uses a compositional device that was not uncommon in landscapes of the time, as I became aware in all my engagements with him over the decades, the device of mismatching the recessions at left and right, with the distant hills marking the horizon much higher on one side of a central mass, here are the trees, than the other. And the same is true of the painting of the rocks, made to look as though they were carved out of wood, and of the pleasant absurdity of the lined-up red leaves along the edge of the tree, each almost readable as a little smiley face. Chen draws the dian, or dots, on top of the rocks in the old traditional way, with a black blob with a touch of mineral green in the center of each one. Next. Here are the rocks and rapids at left of the figure. We can see the edge of his head on the lower right.
My basic argument, to oversimplify it, is that Chen is doing a wry parody of the debased landscape style practiced by too many artists of his time and place, the great old Zhejiang region, where painting had flourished for centuries, and where this kind of painting had fallen into sharp decline. Chen Hongshou was an educated and highly cultivated man who had attempted an official career and failed. He belonged, that is, to that great class of failed literati who produced much of the finest literature and art of the Ming. And he was forced by circumstance to live as a painter and to use styles and subjects that the market demanded. How he managed to transcend that bad situation is a subject basis to any serious study of Chen Hongshou. Next. And here at last we see him in a detail, standing in a mock noble scholar pose at the center of this extraordinary picture, wrapped up in himself and yet projecting a powerful image outward, one that communicates, if we only read it right, all this situation of his and the bitterness he felt about it. He does this with an implicit confidence that there will be viewers who will grasp the implications of what he is doing, the kind of self-presentation he is giving them, along with others who will miss the point totally and think this is the work of a forger. I hope that by now you, or most of you, will have joined me in thinking that this is totally impossible. My treatment of the painting in my compelling image chapter ends with this sentence, quote, "On this self-created stage, Chen stands in a pose of attempted, imperfectly realized dignity, looking almost out at us, almost revealing himself, but remaining finally closed in. He exemplifies in his person and his paintings the wide scope for individualism that late Ming society offered, the questioning or even undermining of tradition that was also possible at the time, and the dangers of both. His self-portrait, even as the work of an artist who found it impossible to make simple statements, is a painting of extraordinary honesty and self-awareness. If there is a better image anywhere in world art of the problematic situation of the intelligent and sensitive man in an absurd world, I do not know it." End quote. Wow, that young person could really write. Next, please. Now you will all be made to gaze at Chen Hongshou and be gazed at almost by him, while I read my translation of his brief essay on painting, with which I ended my other book of that time, The Distant Mountains. I decided, after making my own way tortuously through that great and enigmatic age of painting, to let Chen Hongshou have, as I put it, the last word. Remember, as you listen, that basic to his dilemma was finding himself in the position of continuing a great tradition of painting, that of the Sung masters, that had fallen into heavy decline. And that, as I've said, is in some large part what this whole painting is about. The special importance of that essay, brief as it is that it's a rare exception to what I've called the literati artists and critics controlling the press, doing all the writing that Chinese people read, and that was preserved. Chen Hongshou was able, as a learned man himself, who was not committed to the literati dogma, in fact was quite opposed to it, was able to articulate the situation and the artistic doctrine of the professional master. Okay, now I'm going to read from Chen Hongshou's essay. Artists today do not follow the old masters, relying on a few phrases borrowed from old writings to pass the official examinations, that is. They embark on careers as scholar officials, perhaps attaining some trivial and transient fame for themselves. Thereupon they begin to wave the brush and do paintings. But their brushwork and ink control are not equal to the demands they place on them, and also in terms of verisimilitude, likeness that is, their paintings, alas, do not bear comparison with their subjects. And yet these men use their trifling fame as officials to offer their works for criticism, expecting to be taken seriously as painters, that is. Moreover, they ridicule and criticize other older and accomplished artists. That is what makes me, Old Lotus, most dissatisfied with these illustrious gentlemen. On the other hand, why is it that the professional artists of today, when they imitate Sung painting, fail through excess of artisan skill? It is because they do not encompass Tang styles along with the Sung. Those who imitate Yuan styles, by contrast, fail through excess of rusticity. They do not trace these styles back to their Sung sources. If you can temper the stiffness of Sung with the harmoniousness of Tang, and realize the qualities of Yuan through the order or the rightness of Sung, then you will have achieved the great synthesis. Mei Gong, that is Chun Ji-ru, that was his good friend, says, and he's quoting him, Sung artists are unable to attack fearlessly, that is, to strike to the heart of things. They are not equal to the sparse or summary manner of Yuan, end quote, within the quote. But that is not a valid argument, Chen goes on. What about such Sung period gentlemen as Zhao Lingrong, Dung Ran, Zhu Ran, Wang Shan, Li Gonglin, Mi Fu? Can they be called too detailed or too fussy? They were the forefathers of the Yuan masters such as Huang Gongwang, Nizan, Wu Zhan, Gao Kegong, Zhao Mengfu. When the old masters, venerating tradition, established their methods, they were never other than strict and cautious. Nizan's sketchy pictures, for instance, all are carefully arranged and follow the rules. The great and later generals Li, that is Li Zishun, Li Jiaodao, Li Cheng, Zhao Baoju, all these, even when they painted highly elaborate pictures with 1,000 gates and myriad doors, 1,000 mountains and myriad streams, always gave them a harmonious air. If one regards their works open-mindedly and studies them, how can he possibly say that Sung is not the equal of Yuan? There are, to be sure, detestable painters also in the Sung. Ma Yuan and Xia Gui are really the ones who have given Sung painters a bad name. Then, last paragraph. I, Old Lotus, therefore exhort these illustrious gentlemen to study the old masters and to examine Sung painting exhaustively so as to arrive at the end at Yuan. I exhort the professional artists to model themselves on the Sung masters, but entreat them also to include Tang styles in their studies. If you truly immerse your mind in this way, you will attain the true lineage of painting. When dealing with the various masters, you will recognize that this kind of brushwork comes from such and such a painter, that conception comes from such and such a painter. The generational images will not be confused, and the artists will all be lined up in order. When, after that, you begin to paint, then you can move freely over the whole world. I, Old Lotus, am now 54. My hometown, that's Chentong, lacks any artist who can revive the study of painting. I wipe my eyes, and I wait for one to appear. Okay, that's the end of Chen Hongshou's remarkable essay. Okay, now we go on. I introduce the next Chen Hongshou painting we'll look at with these two photos, C.C. Wang on the left, Sherman Li on the right, along with his longtime curator, Weigam He and Max Luhr. Wang, who was among other things a dealer in Chinese paintings, had a Chen Hongshou painting that Sherman wanted very much for his museum. But Wang, citing that well-known phrase that pairs Chen with his northern contemporary Cui Zizhong, that is, Chen in the south, Cui in the north, non-Chen, Bei Cui, insisted on selling paintings by the two of them as a pair. Next, the work by Cui Zizhong at left, which I've already shown in an earlier lecture, representing a Taoist adept traveling to heaven with his entire family, and the one by Chen Hongshou at the right, a birthday painting that he did in 1638 for his aunt. Sherman, although he didn't especially want the Cui Zizhong painting, finally bit the bullet and bought them both. Of course, he was smart to get both, because the Cui Zizhong is a fine painting too. I've reproduced and discussed the Chen Hongshou painting 3 times in my Fantastics and Eccentrics exhibition, my Distant Mountains, my Painter's Practice. It's not only a highly diverting painting, but it has a good story attached to it. Next. Chen Hongshou painted this one in 1638 for the 60th birthday of his aunt, flattering her by portraying her as a learned lady of the distant past, Lady Shan Wenjun. All this is explained in detail in Chen's long inscription written at the top of the painting. A translation of that inscription by Weigam He is in the entry for this painting in the 8 Dynasties catalog. But instead of reading that, which you can find and read for yourselves, let me read from Distant Mountains, top of page 249, what I wrote about this painting there. Chen Hongshou's Lady Shanwan expounding the classics, painted in 1638, is another example of his use of double imagery that overlays past on present. The painting was done as a gift to his aunt on her 60th birthday, and compares her flatteringly to a learned woman of antiquity. Lady Xuanwen had been instructed by her father in the Zhouguan, or the ritual of the Zhou dynasty, a book thought to have been written by the Duke of Zhou, the regent to the first ruler of the dynasty, and an exemplar for Confucius and others of the highest virtues of that golden age. Because of its authorship, her father advised her this classic was the best source for standards of conduct, canonical precedents, and governmental organization. She studied it diligently. Later, at a time when studies of classical texts had declined to a low state, she was summoned at the age of 80 by the king to teach her understanding of the text to 120 young scholars. Some of them are seen in Chen Hongshou's painting, sitting in rows. Lady Xuanwen lectured from behind a curtain, which Chen Hongshou has raised here to allow us to see her. She sits behind a screen, a frail but commanding figure, with wisdom in her wrinkled prune face. The landscape, painted on the screen, echoes in style the landscape with which the whole painting opens in the foreground. This correspondence, besides providing another double image effect, brackets the space occupied by the figures. The location of that space in the far middle ground, as in the case of similar compositions we've considered, removes it from the realm of present reality. Where Chen exposes himself openly to the viewer's inspection in his 1635 self-portrait, he allows his aunt, or her assigned antique image, to recede decently into the distance. Such distancing in time and space is emphasized by archaistic elements of style, the long-sleeved robes and the elongated faces of the male figures, drawn from some pre-Tang model, the fungus-shaped clouds, the firmly outlined distant promontories, the additive character of the whole composition. Coloring with rich contrasting pigments gives the painting more decorative beauty than our reproduction can convey. Okay, so much for the quotation. Now back to the regular lecture. Jesus, I hope I can finish this. Okay. Continuing. What I would like to call your attention to here, and more broadly for Chen Hongshou's paintings, is that the image of the old woman is a double image, the learned lady of classical antiquity and aunt. In my writings on Chen Hongshou, especially in the compelling image chapter centered on him and his self-portrait, I've called attention over and over to this subtle quality of his central figural imagery, a quality that isn't peculiar to him. Wu Bin does something like it for landscape painting, but is especially strong and effectively employed in the works of certain late Ming artists. Is the woman in the He Qianzhang portrait He's real concubine, or an ideal picture of a woman? Answer, she is both. And the superimposed image is in itself a commentary, as we can take it to be, on the status of women in that society. How much individuality are they permitted to display? Next, please. Chen Hongshou's self-portrait is at the same time an image of the ideal scholar gentleman seen with his servant in the landscape. Chen means to call up that conventional imagery and overlay it onto it his particular ironic comment on his personal situation in a debased world. Irony is perhaps the best word for the relationship between these real and ideal images. And in my compelling image chapter, I argued that behind this irony is a dense overlay of engagement with an ideal culture of the distant past onto a bitter acceptance of their inability to recapture that ideal for their own time in its original form and with its original values intact. I deeply believe that recognizing the complexity of this overlaid imagery, as I've tried to do in various of my writings, is a key to understanding late Ming painting in a way that really gets under the surface. Let's keep that complex observation in mind as we turn to the last of the Chen Hongshou paintings that we'll look at in this lecture, his handscroll representing the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. Now, On to the handscroll painting by Chen Hongshou that is our main subject today. The handscroll representing the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. Those of you who watched our first series on early Chinese painting will remember from the third lecture on 6 dynasties painting the designs of tomb tiles found on the walls of tombs near Nanjing, representing the 7 sages of the bamboo grove, actually showing them beneath trees. Chen Hongshou didn't know those images, but he did have the opportunity to see old paintings, probably mostly while he was serving briefly in the capital as a painter. Next. Some old model must underlie his painting his placing of the 7 sages in a grove of trees instead of among bamboo, as we see here in a preview of one section of his scroll at the right. Also, his understanding of pre-Tang figure painting, next, is clearly visible in the way he portrays the individual figures with elongated faces and robes drawn with continuous fine lines. Just as landscapists in the Orthodox school assumed a certain knowledge of antique landscape styles in their viewers and used stylistic allusions that those viewers would recognize, so Chen Hongshou assumes some familiarity with early figure painting, even if it was only in copies and imitations in his audience. Next. And still later artists were to allude back to Chen Hongshou, as Luo Ping does in the 1799 painting that we've used for the title and ending credits for this series as an ideal image of gazing into the past. In trying to convey some sense of how these highly sophisticated allusions to old styles worked in later Chinese painting, I used to draw on my love of certain recent and contemporary French composers, notably the disciples of Satie, known as Les Six, the 6, and especially among them Francis Poulenc and Darius Milhaud. They could conjure up bittersweet evocations of romantic music with tinges of popular song. The effect is hard to describe, but the musical among you will know what I mean. Once when Max Lohr came to visit me while I was a student in Ann Arbor, I played for him a recording I had just purchased of a Poulenc piano concerto that evoked and somewhat or semi-parodied romantic styles in music in this way. And when it was finished, Max said gravely, "Composers should not be allowed to write such music." And he was perfectly serious, dead serious. It was for him a desecration of the German romantic styles that he was devoted to. But enough of that. I've either convinced or conveyed my point about stylistic allusions, or I haven't. On to look at the paintings next. But one more image before we turn to the scroll. This photograph of Walter Hochstetter, familiar already from earlier lectures about paintings that he owned. During my year as a fellow at the Metropolitan Museum in 1953-4, Walter showed me the paintings that he kept rather secretly in his New York apartment, and a special treasure among them was this Chen Hongshou handscroll of the 7 sages. Here is the scroll in 4 sections. I'm going to show the 4 color images just as a preliminary. Walter never tried to sell the scroll. Along with one other handscroll painting he had, a Yuan Dynasty picture of horsemen, he kept it as a valuable personal possession. He permitted me to reproduce in my compelling image book 3 sections of it, including the crucial ending, more of it than had been published by anybody before. But he still reserved the first section, his special favorite, to publish himself. After his death, his heirs put the scroll into auction at Christie's Hong Kong in autumn 2009, and it sold for a big price. But then the buyer was told by 2 Shanghai Museum curators, Shan Guolin and Zheng Yinlan, that in their opinion it was not a genuine work, but a later copy, and the buyer returned it and got his money back. Hochstetter's heirs, James and Paul Zhu, who were sons of the Chinese woman that Walter lived with late in his life, wrote me asking if I would certify the genuineness of the painting, in my opinion, with a legal affidavit stating that, and I agreed. James Drew, at my request, as a kind of condition really, made the color images that I'm going to use in this presentation that follows. He's an amateur photographer without the professional equipment or the expertise to make photos of the kind that we're used to, and we have to keep that in mind while we're looking at the pictures. at the last minute, I insert here a bit of new information. Just last night, I received an email telling me that the scroll has gone back to the auction, this time to Sotheby's, to be auctioned perhaps in New York, Sotheby's in March, or at any rate in the near future. And this gives a special urgency to my effort to convince everybody that this has to be a genuine, not only genuine, but actually a very fine, even a great work by Chen Hongshou. So if you are a millionaire with lots of money and you're going to this auction, buy this painting. Next. For this first of the 4 sections of the paintings, I'll use a black and white image. I'm sure that this is the same painting that Walter showed me back in 1953-4, by the way, because I have good photos from that time, one of which I'll show later. This first section was Walter's favorite, and the one that he wouldn't let me reproduce when I published the other 3. It shows 4 servants of these 7 sages carrying 2 big pots of wine on poles over their shoulders, between and behind huge rocks, approaching the sages to replenish their stock of wine. 2 of the servants are seen only as heads above the rocks. Next. The upper right corner of the scroll, with what I assume is a collector's seal. The drawing is done in fine, continuous line, taken from antique painting. But seen close up as here, it can be seen to follow also, in some places, the old nail's head rat tail convention, the line being thick at one end and trailing off to a point at the other. This is only one of the many refinements that persuade me that this work cannot be a fake or copy. Next, please. I can see why Walter liked this opening so much. The rocks are shaped in strong sculptural ways with line and graded washes, and some brown and bluish color. Showing only the upper parts of the servants is a play on another old convention, by which the principal figures were revealed completely and lesser ones partly hidden. Next. The comically low-class faces of the servants, with their doleful expressions, are another of the painting's charms. There's some interior drawing on the rocks along with the washes. Nothing done by Chen Hongshou is merely routine or conventional. Next, please. The setting of the forest, with its grotesquely twisted and knotty old trees, bunches of flowers, and rows of bright blue grasses on the ground. Also the beginning of the bamboo grove, seen between the trees in middle distance. Playful archaism in figures is one thing, and understandable, but playful archaism in landscape elements is quite another, and hard to understand, how he did it, that is. Nothing could be further, more different, from the earnest imitations of old landscape styles, the type called Fang, that was practiced at this time by Dongqi Chang and his literati followers. The varied coloring of the trees is part of the highly formal, artificial, but elusive air of the whole picture. Even the mist changes color from white to pale red-brown and back to white as it drifts through the bamboo. The grotesque forms and surfaces of the trees somehow recall the exposed bone and muscle structures of organic things that have grown old and emaciated. I could go on endlessly trying to articulate some of the multi-layered elusiveness of this painting. Next, please. Rolling on, we see the first 2 of the 7 sages. One of them, sitting on a rock and turning to look leftward, one hand on his knee, holds a musical instrument, mostly hidden, but probably the yuan, a lute-like plucked instrument. Next. The same figure is seen closer. Even within this exaggeratedly antique style of drawing, Chen Hongshou manages to suggest solid bodies beneath the heavy robes, a feature more of his own time than of true antiquity, when they mostly would have been bodiless, with the robes occupying space, but without any sense of real bodies beneath them. There are exceptions, but mostly that was true. Next. The next section, revealing the first 3 of the 7 sages, and the stone table in the clearing around which they have gathered. The second sage, his back to us, holds a fan in one hand and a wine cup in the other. Their clothing is loosened, and they sit in what is meant to be relaxed postures, expressive of their untrammeled ease, their escape from the constraints of society. A big green wine pot with the handle of a ladle protruding from its mouth is on the table before them. Next. The third of the 7 sages lies comfortably on the stone table, his back resting against a raised section of natural stone placed for that purpose at one end. One arm and one leg are draped over a long staff, the other leg turned upward with the foot showing, the other arm with hands stretched out, pressed against the stone table, bearing some of his weight. His red sandals are placed on the ground before him. His long hair spills over his shoulders. Notice, by the way, the bamboo stalks above his head and to the left. Do they look odd, curiously lacking in variety and interest? We will see why in a moment. But let me insert here, next. Early in the chapter on Chen Hongshou in my compelling image book, I reproduced these two pictures together. The lower one is, of course, one of the 7 sages from the 5th century tomb near Nanjing. The upper image is a self-portrait that Chen Hongshou painted as one leaf in an album fairly early in his career, in 1627, with a long inscription that I partly translate there. The sprawled, archaistic figure, with its real sense of an articulated body beneath the clothing, unlike so many other human figures in the 6th Dynasty's painting and pictorial design, as I said, is a type that Chen Hongshou seems to have known about, not from these tomb murals, which he couldn't have seen, but from some other source. The oddly bent, reclining figure of Chen's 3rd sage follows this type, with more of the body exposed. Next, we'll go back to that. The next section of the scroll reveals the 4th and 5th of the 7 sages. But before I speak of them, let me talk of the rows of stiffly upright bamboo stalks above them in the distance, continuing the ones we saw above the 3rd sage. How could Chen Hongshou's unfailing ability to make diverting variety, even within repetitive passages, have failed him so badly here? Next. The answer is, it didn't. That's not the hand of Chen Hongshou at work up there, but the hand of Walter Hochstetter, along with the hand of his Hong Kong mounter, probably. Walter, as I related before, had the very bad habit of altering paintings to change or remove places he didn't like. He always claimed that he was really restoring the painting to its original form, taking out a place that had been added, but that wasn't true in many cases, or most cases. And in this case, as he told me on showing me the painting, he disliked the mist that originally wound its way through this middle-distance bamboo grove, as you can see in the photograph, and simply removed it, or not so simply, rather laboriously, and replaced it with the, what seems to me at least, dull, repetitive series of bamboo stalks. When Elizabeth Hammer of Christie's wrote to tell me that they were putting the scroll into auction, I immediately wrote back to her to inform her of this change and to recommend that she get access to the original photos of it that I had received from Walter and were still in the department files, and reproduce those in the catalog also. To her great credit, she did this, taking a lot of trouble to find, with some help from Pat Berger, the mounted photos in our old photo archive in Dole Library, no longer in use and stored in an obscure place. My point is that the purchaser of the scroll should know about this alteration and be able to make the decision whether to attempt to restore it to its original form, but that would be difficult and probably unwise. Anyway, she did find and copy the old photos and reproduce this one in her catalog. I now have the photos myself, and I preserve them for future Chen Hongshou scholars as important documents. I don't like this alteration of Walter's, but I don't think that it changes or hurts this wonderful scroll enough to make it any less worth owning. I insert that for any possible buyer. Next, please. Returning to look at the 4th of the 7 sages, he sits on the ground, turned back toward the others, flowers in his hair, holding what appears to be a wine ladle, and leaning back against a bundle of scrolls, of which only the ends are seen. Under him is a kind of animal skin, of which only the protruding edges can be seen. A flowing stream has appeared behind him, separating him from the bamboo grove. If we were to look back, we would see it as a pale blue strip behind the first 3 sages, unnoticed before. Next. The flowing water takes on more prominence as we roll further. Another tall tree appears, and behind it we glimpse the 5th sage. But before we turn to him, let's gaze once more at the dull, repetitive grove of bamboo stalks up above, which Walter somehow preferred to Chen Hongshou's original, more interesting image of the bamboo grove with mist drifting through it. Curse you, Walter, for doing this. Next, please. But enough of that. The section of the scroll that follows introduces more foreground trees, as interestingly bizarre as the one seen earlier in the scroll. Two of these, the closest ones, have elaborately imagined root structures. The fifth and sixth of the seven sages are mostly hidden behind these trees, with only their upper faces and parts of their bodies seen around them. The fifth sage simply sits leaning forward, listening intently to the music played by the others, which, as always in such scenes, we have to imagine as blending in a way that they felt or knew to be cosmically significant in a Taoist way, blending with the natural sounds of the running stream, the wind in the trees. Next. The sixth sage is playing a chin or zither, his right hand touching the strings, his left hand resting on his right wrist. Next. Moving on to the next section, we have seen six sages and are, of course, anticipating the seventh. But Chen Hongshou makes us wait for a while he shows us more trees, nearer and further, more odd flowering plants growing from the ground. At the top, our gaze is drawn back more and more into depth, with masses of foliage hanging and trees and bamboo stalks growing up at further and further distance. Next. The trees close up. As I was saying before, Chen Hongshou's highly idiosyncratic way of treating plant and animal forms, so that the plants seem capable of animation almost with musculature and bones, as if, imparts a strange ambiguity to our visual responses to these images. We lean toward misreading them, then correct ourselves, and the back and forth gives depth to the experience. Next. The arrival of the seventh sage is put off still longer, as quieter spaces follow the busy ones. The stream broadens. A few of the bamboo stalks move into the middle ground and are seen complete, with their twigs and leaves spread out in large, flat patterns. Next. And the thatched top of a tingzi, or kiosk, protrudes from the lower margin of the scroll, implying a complete structure, complete building down below, unseen. What appears to be rose vines in bloom wind around its top, with tiny spiraling tendrils that hold our attention for a moment, before it is abruptly shifted to, next please, the seventh sage, seen at last. But he appears not to be moving confidently forward to join the others. He stands alone, his cloak drooping around him, a would-be seventh sage uncertain about how he will be received by the others. And he's depicted in a way quite different from the unambiguous archaism of the others. As an image, and especially his face, has a strange air of contemporary presence, and a strange sense of someone who doesn't quite know what he is doing there, and feels awkward about it. Next. So who is he really? A question for which the right answer cannot be simple and cannot be stated quickly. My belief, expressed in my treatment of this painting in my compelling image book, is that he probably represents on some level the person for whom Chen Hongshou painted the scroll, identified in his inscription as Taoist Che-Chen. We are confronted here, that is, with another double image, like Chen Hongshou's self-portrait or his picture of his aunt, in which the portrayal of a real living person is superimposed on or merged with the conventional image of an ideal figure from antiquity. Next, please. The last section, with Chen Hongshou's brief inscription, a dedication reading, "Old Lotus," that's Chen's name for himself, "for Taoist Che-Chen has imitated the Tang masters," end quote. Meaning painters of antiquity, he was not really specifying Tang as distinct from pre-Tang. While we gaze longer at this unexpected and profoundly puzzling and moving ending to what presents itself as a painting of the seven sages of the bamboo grove, let me read what I wrote about it in my compelling image book. 4 of the sages form a group in the central section. As we roll further, we find 2 more partly hidden behind trees. The fantastic elaboration of roots and knotty trunks, the succession of decorative foliage patterns, are Chen Hongshou's exaggerated versions of forms that he saw in antique paintings, or very probably in imitations and forgeries of antique paintings. They serve here to characterize the human figures with which they are visually compacted, attributing to them qualities of unconventionality and antique crotchetiness, along with the sterner virtues that twisted old trees stood for. At the end of the scroll stands the seventh sage, or at least someone who seems to want to join the other six. He stands in a rather dejected pose, wearing a cape and straw hat that are supposed to give him the aspect of a carefree wanderer, but in fact make him look slightly absurd. He is portrayed in a mode quite different from the others, and strongly suggests, especially since he turns his eyes to look out at us, that Chen Hongshou has inserted a portrait of some friend in place of one of the seven sages. It is probably the unidentified Taoist Chen, to whom Chen dedicates the scroll in his inscription at the end. I want to use this remarkable painting, my own long-time engagement with it, and the present occasion for returning once more to that engagement to try to articulate what I think the role of the art historian should be. I always told my serious students in seminars that our main task on the highest level is answering for this or that work of art or body of art the question, what is the artist up to? That was a brief and slangy way of conveying, I think, essentially the same message as Baxendale conveys in the crucial arguments of his book, Patterns of Intention. Penetrating and articulating the artist's intention is the deepest responsibility of the art historian. But conveying what the artist is up to requires imparting lots of information, and not just factual information, to one's readers and viewers. What did viewers of the artist's time, sophisticated ones, the kinds that an artist like Chen Hongshou painted for, what did they expect to get in the paintings they commissioned? What was in their stores of memories of paintings they had seen? What visual knowledge and memories, that is, could Chen Hongshou count on in the viewers that he was working for? He did some popular paintings along with his assistants, pictures for use and pleasure, to coin a phrase, done for that greater mass of Chinese viewers outside the literati male minority. But much of his patronage, necessarily given his situation and the nature of the society around him, came from those literati males with their mental storage attics, full of imagery and stylistic memories from their long experience of looking at old and new paintings. And the Taoist Chen of Chen's dedicatory inscription, whoever he was surely one of those, and Chen Hongshou could please him, flatter him, by doing a work for him that presupposed such memories, a work that drew on them and played on them in a way they assumed them in his patron. So where does that leave your old scholar-lecturer? In a position where he must, to fulfill his responsibility toward those sensitive and intelligent viewers out there who would like to respond in a knowing way to these great paintings from a far distant culture, in much the same way they can already respond to literature and music and Western art on levels that depend on programs built into their brains. They want me, that is, to fill them in with pictures and words so that they will be able to respond more fully to what a complex artist like Chen Hongshou was up to, so to speak. And the degree of success I can claim for a lecture like this one is, in the end, the degree to which I have managed to convey in images and words what Chen Hongshou was doing for Taoist Chen that pleased that patron and upheld Chen's reputation as an artist who could be relied on to do that for his customers and patrons. And that final statement, once made, seems to me so basic and valuable as a statement of what I've been up to, or tried to be up to, throughout much of my long career as an art historian, that I think I'll put it on my website for those of you who may want to reread it and try to understand better what I'm saying, or trying to say. So, farewell to those of my viewers, who are of course also welcome, who are video lookers only, while to those who may follow this up by looking for this long statement and reading it on my website, goodbye for now. See you on jamescahill.info. Sincerely, James Cahill.